Let's pray together. God, help us to hear your voice, feel your presence, and learn your love. Amen. On a Sunday several years ago, for a very quick demonstration that I didn't think was going to cause much issue, I had kind of mapped off several of the pews in the church and asked people to move forward or backward based on the depth of your faith. Does anybody remember this Sunday? I remember, I think almost everybody moved forward. I don't remember anybody moving further back, which is interesting, right? But there was one lady in particular. I didn't really pay any attention to anybody specifically when we did the demonstration. And I didn't pay attention to where she moved or how close she sat at the time or if she moved at all. But this really bothered her. And I came to hear about it several weeks after the fact. And she didn't like to move because she has a seat and that's where she will sit. And who am I to tell her to move? I'm not God, was the quote. I was a bit surprised by her reaction because I wasn't really demanding anything, but I was hoping for something. The idea behind the demonstration, my hope was that we'd recognize how uncomfortable we've become in expressing our faiths. Nobody jumped up at the chance to move. We all kind of waited for someone else to go first. Then we took our cue and moved accordingly. Even within the walls of this place, which we would all probably say are safe, it still makes us uncomfortable to show how we feel about our faiths. And it made this particular woman so uncomfortable that she was upset about it weeks later. So we're going to start today with a big question. If I can open this. What makes you uncomfortable? Is that spelled correctly? Whoa, I forgot about that. It's been so long since we've done the board. Wow. What makes you uncomfortable? That's a good one to start with, to say very loudly, talking in front of a group. Oh, strangers. What else? Confrontation. Spiders. What? Negativity. Death. Oh, that's a good one. Gossip. Sure, we could probably fill this whole board with things that make us uncomfortable. It's amazing how comfortable we just were at saying things that make us uncomfortable. Why? Why do these things make us feel uncomfortable? Unfamiliarity. Each individual is different. It's because each of these things, that unfamiliarity, each of these things brings about this tension in our lives. It brings about a dissonance between what we want to feel and the way we actually feel when those are presented to us. Especially probably spiders. Right? We want to have a nice, happy life, and then bam, spider. It brings tension into our lives. In the Gospel of John, Jesus' ministry lasts for 3 years. And it's outlined so that we know that it's 3 years long. And I like this because it means that his disciples believed him enough to leave their families, their jobs, their communities, to invest all their time and energy into Jesus and his teaching for 3 years. That is some amazing commitment. What kind of draw would make someone commit like that? The promise of a better life might make one of us commit for 3 years, right? Imagine some of the fantasy scenarios that were running through the disciples' minds. I'm sure some of them were hoping that he would be a political revolutionary. Others were probably hoping he would become an earthly king in the line of King David, and others might have been hoping for personal or familial wealth. And the words of Jesus about bringing justice to the poor and the downtrodden rang true for those who were looked over by the religious and political and social constructs of the time. A commitment that was probably fueled by faith in the hope of liberation. So much hope is present there. And their commitment is driven by this hope for something better. And then Jesus comes to them and says, I will die. I can't imagine being there and hearing him say that. I am going to die. No, this can't be. You are our hope, and now you're going to die? Imagine the hopelessness of those who have committed their lives to him. He is arrested, he's mocked, he's nailed to a tree, he is bleeding and weeping and dying, and they must have asked, now what? A couple of those disciples who had devoted their lives to him, who had left everything, given everything to follow him, are walking along the road after all this has happened when a third man appears. And this man shows up and he essentially just says, hey, what's going on? And the disciple Cleopas replies in Luke 24, verses 18 through 21, it reads, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days? He asked them, what things? And they replied, the things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. We had hoped that he would bring redemption. We had hoped that our lives would get better. We had hoped that we wouldn't have to run into this tension anymore. Of course they were down. Of course they were upset. Of course we too, we have these moments of feeling alone, of feeling regretful, of feeling uncomfortable with our position in life. So this man on the road that shows up and starts asking these questions, he starts to question them more, and he starts to teach them about Scripture and about the Messiah. Imagine being in these disciples' shoes. You just witnessed the man that you've devoted your life to for 3 years die, and now this stranger is teaching you about him? That's got to be tough. And they still don't recognize who he is. They don't know who he is until he does something. And it isn't until he blesses and breaks bread, and suddenly they see him. Their eyes are opened, and they suddenly realize that they've been accompanied by the resurrected Christ. But what intrigues me most about this story, a lot of times it's the question of why couldn't they see, and now that they can see. But this year, what really intrigues me about this story is what they say to each other when they realize who this man is. In verse 32, we read what they say. They say, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the Scriptures to us? What an interesting phrase, right? We're not our hearts burning within us. Have you ever had heartburn? It's survivable, right? I've had it. I've never really had it that bad. But I'd say it isn't a terrible pain, but it is terribly uncomfortable, right? I've broken a bone that had to get set. That was much more painful than heartburn. But heartburn is really uncomfortable. It causes you to toss and turn, to reposition yourself, to hope for some form of relief. And it's something that distresses you just enough that it's hard to not think about it. You can't just tell your mind, oh, don't worry, I'll stop thinking about it. How about in your calling? Have you ever had heartburn in regard to your calling? These disciples knew something was going on during their walk. On looking back, they could tell that their hearts were burning because they were unaware of Jesus' presence, and they were too caught up in themselves. And so they were given this discomfort. Kyle Idleman wrote a book on this idea that we can only truly come to know Jesus when we reach the end of ourselves, when we get out of our own way. And in his book, The End of Me, he writes about calling a man named Brian. Brian had left him a message that his toddler son had died a few weeks ago, and he would like to talk to Kyle. And Kyle's a pastor of a church in Louisville, Kentucky. And Kyle calls the man, calls him back, and when he's talking to him, he allows for that uncomfortable silence. He allows for that silence to just kind of settle into the conversation. It's at that point in the silence when Brian says to him, "I backed over him." Kyle was unaware of this fact, and he writes about it. He was unprepared for this kind of information. But he knew that Brian was reaching out. Brian was calling him for a reason. And so he asked Brian if he wants to talk more about that. And as Brian was talking, he said, quote, "I feel like I reached this point in my life when I had absolutely nothing left. And it runs out for the first time in my life. Jesus has become real. Do you know what I mean? Is that unusual?" Kyle was certain that this wasn't unusual, and so he went to Facebook. That's so many of us would do that, I guess. And he asked for his followers to finish this sentence. He wrote, "Jesus became real when?" Here are some of the responses that people wrote back. Jesus became real when? I was told I had 3 months to live because of stage 4 cancer. I found out my husband was having an affair, and I never felt more alone in my life. I sat on my bed with my dad's gun in my hand, but said a prayer before pulling the trigger. I don't remember the last time I had prayed. It became clear that I had lost control of my addiction. The divorce papers arrived in the mail, and I could no longer pretend I could fix things. Jesus reached into one of the darkest places on earth, a strip club, to show me he loved me. I realized there was no place he couldn't find me. My depression became too much for me to bear. I was forced out of my 30-year job and had no idea what I was going to do. I was pregnant. My kidneys were failing, and the doctors told me to abort. I prayed for the first time in a long time. My daughter is now 23. I finally admitted I wasn't strong enough to save my marriage or end my addiction to porn. My husband was killed in a car accident. The ultrasound said the baby's heart had stopped beating. Jesus became real when I came to the end of me. You notice, not a single one of those was Jesus became real when I sat comfortably in my lazy boy. I love myself. Actually, I own a lazy boy, since we're saying that. And it is very comfortable, so that's probably why I thought of that example. I love myself. I like to treat myself to nice things. I mean, who doesn't? I like to be by myself. I like to make sure that my needs are met. And sometimes I like to be a little excessive in how nice I am to me. Does anyone else ever feel this way? What? Not one of you? One. Thank you. One person out there is like, yeah, I like to treat myself. If you don't, I say go ahead and watch a few commercials and you'll start to see what we're supposed to lavishly treat ourselves with, right? So coming to an end of this, of me, putting aside our expectations of God to put us first, seeing that liberation of the oppressed is a bigger picture than my immediate needs, coming to the end of me is uncomfortable. It brings tension in our lives because we feel this desire to serve self over others, this human fallenness within us that says, I am better than. And to put that aside to serve God is like heartburn. But being uncomfortable is an opportunity to grow. When we look back at these uncomfortable moments, talking in front of others, maybe not spiders, but death and strangers, confrontation, negativity, gossip, confronting those uncomfortable moments gives us an opportunity to grow as people, to grow in relationships, to grow with God. And when we look back at those uncomfortable moments in our lives, like the people who responded to Kyle's question, we can see Christ's presence. And I think that's why we're a little uncomfortable in those moments. We didn't recognize that the Prince of Peace was sitting there beside us because we're too consumed in ourselves. And so this little burning sensation grew within us to push us to act, to respond to Christ's unknown presence. Now, these disciples had walked a long way with Jesus, and it was getting dark, and they were tired and ready for rest. And he was going to keep walking, and they said, no, it's getting too dark. Why don't you stay the night here? So we know that it's getting late. But when they noticed Christ was with them, we read, they said to each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us? That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and their companions gathered together, and they were saying, the Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon. Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. They immediately took off to tell the others what had happened. They immediately went and shared the good news. The remedy to their heartburn was to evangelize, to share their story. The remedy was to share their faiths. And the result is that Jesus again appears to them all, and he instills in them a burning desire to serve and to start a new movement that would forever change the world. A movement based on being moved to serve one another. Because when we don't, when we get stuck on ourselves and our own comfort, Christ shows up and gives us a little push through a little bit of heartburn and discomfort. And so how would we answer this question? Jesus became real when? We're going to leave this board up here. Throughout service, throughout the rest of the day. Maybe we'll leave it up for a couple of days. If at any moment you feel like you want to answer that question, you can come forward and you can write on it when Jesus became real in your life so that you can share your story, share your faith, share the comfort that God has given you so that others might feel comfort in their lives as well. Amen.